She was never supposed to find the text messages. But as Eliza scrolled through his phone that night, her world collapsed around her. Just a few more weeks of this charade, he'd written to his friend. Once I get access to her family's company, I'm out. She's so desperate for love she can't even see what's happening. Eliza's hands trembled as she placed his phone back on the nightstand, her engagement ring suddenly feeling like a shackle rather than a promise. How could she have been so blind? And why, despite everything she'd just discovered, did her heart still ache for him? If you're enjoying this story of deception, heartbreak and unexpected redemption, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more emotional journeys that will keep you on the edge of your seat until the very end. Marcus Blackwood had always been good at getting what he wanted. Growing up with nothing had taught him that the world belonged to those willing to take it. His handsome face and practiced charm were simply tools, weapons, really, that had served him well in climbing from poverty to the edge of wealth. All he needed was one final push to secure his place among Boston's elite. That push had a name, Eliza Harrington. The Harrington family owned one of the largest private shipping companies on the East Coast, and Eliza was their only heir. When Marcus first spotted her at a charity gala, he didn't see a woman, he saw an opportunity. Quiet, bookish, and perpetually overlooked, she practically radiated insecurity beneath her expensive dress. Marcus recognized vulnerability when he saw it. He'd spent his life exploiting it. Target acquired, he'd texted his business partner that night. "Give me 6 months, and Harrington Shipping will be ripe for our takeover." The plan was simple: seduce Eliza, propose marriage, gain insider access to the company's vulnerabilities, then orchestrate a hostile takeover that would leave him wealthy and her family ruined. After that, he'd manufacture a reason to leave her. A clean break. Business, not personal. What Marcus hadn't counted on was Eliza herself. Their first date had gone according to plan. He'd researched her thoroughly, learning that she ran the company's charitable foundation and had a passion for 19th-century literature. He'd memorized enough Austen quotes to seem impressively well-read and feigned interest in her foundation's work with underprivileged children. "I've never met anyone who actually listens when I talk," she'd said at the end of the evening, her eyes bright with something that made Marcus momentarily uncomfortable. Hope. He'd pushed the feeling aside and kissed her hand, already calculating how quickly he could accelerate their relationship. By their 5th date, he'd convinced himself that the strange tightness in his chest whenever she smiled was just indigestion. By their 10th, he'd stopped checking his watch when she spoke about her dreams. After 3 months, his business partner Ryan was getting impatient. "You're taking too long," he'd complained during their secret meetings. "She's just a mark. Don't tell me you're actually falling for this girl." Marcus had laughed it off. "Please. I'm just being thorough. These old money types are suspicious by nature. I need her to trust me completely." But something was changing. Marcus found himself calling Eliza even when it wasn't necessary for the con. He caught himself buying books he thought she might enjoy, not because it would impress her, but because he wanted to see her face light up. Worst of all, he'd begun to dread the endgame, the moment when he would have to reveal himself as the architect of her family's downfall. "It's just method acting," he told himself. "I'm just getting too deep into the role." 6 months in, right on schedule, he proposed. The ring cost more than he could afford, but he'd justified the expense as an investment. When she'd said yes, tears streaming down her face, he'd felt like the worst kind of monster. And yet, he couldn't stop now. Too much was at stake. With the engagement secured, Marcus gained the trust of Eliza's father, Harold Harrington, a stern, suspicious man who had initially regarded Marcus with thinly veiled contempt. But even Harold eventually warmed to the charming young man who seemed to make his daughter so happy. "I'd like you to start learning the business," Harold had said one evening, clapping Marcus on the shoulder. "If you're going to be family, you should understand what you're getting into." It was exactly what Marcus had been waiting for. Within weeks, he had access to financial records, client lists, and internal systems, all the information Ryan needed to engineer their takeover. Every night, Marcus would wait until Eliza fell asleep before sending data to his partner. And every morning, he'd wake up hating himself a little more. The night Eliza discovered the truth began like any other. They'd had dinner with her parents, discussing wedding plans and company business. Marcus had been distracted, knowing that within days, Ryan would execute the first phase of their plan, approaching key Harrington clients with offers they couldn't refuse, designed to destabilize the company's foundation. When they returned to their apartment, Marcus had stepped into the shower, leaving his phone on the nightstand. He never locked it around Eliza, a calculated show of trust that was part of his cover. He'd never expected her to look through it. She wasn't the type. But that night, when his phone buzzed repeatedly with messages from Ryan, something prompted her to check. Perhaps some subconscious part of her had sensed the deception all along. The messages were explicit, detailing their plans, mocking her naivety, discussing how they would dismantle her family's legacy piece by piece. And worst of all, revealing the lie at the heart of their relationship. When Marcus emerged from the shower, he found Eliza sitting on the edge of the bed, his phone in her lap, her engagement ring placed neatly beside it. "How long?" she asked, her voice eerily calm. "How long have you been planning this?" The moment Marcus had rehearsed countless times in his head had arrived, but all his prepared explanations and exit strategies evaporated. Standing before her, seeing the devastation in her eyes, he couldn't summon the callousness needed to complete the con. "Since before we met," he admitted, his voice barely audible. Eliza nodded slowly, as if confirming something she'd suspected. "And none of it was real? Not one moment?" Marcus opened his mouth to deliver the final blow, to tell her that she'd been nothing but a stepping stone. The words would be cruel, but clean, allowing her to hate him completely and move on. It would be a mercy, of sorts. But he couldn't do it. "I don't know anymore," he said instead, the truth spilling out before he could stop it. "It started as a con, but somewhere along the way, I got lost." Eliza stood up, her composure finally breaking. "Get out," she whispered, then louder, "Get out." Marcus left that night with nothing but the clothes on his back, the sound of her sobs following him down the hallway. He checked into a cheap motel and called Ryan. "She knows everything," he said flatly. Ryan cursed. "So we accelerate the plan. We have enough to move forward. By this time next week, Harrington shipping will be in chaos, and will be positioned to pick up the pieces at pennies on the dollar." Marcus closed his eyes, seeing Eliza's face. "I'm out." "What? You can't be serious. After all this work?" "I'm out," Marcus repeated, hanging up. That night, he did something he hadn't done since childhood. He cried until there were no tears left, mourning not just the relationship he'd destroyed, but the person he'd become. The next morning, Marcus did the unthinkable. He went to Harold Harrington's office and confessed everything. The older man listened in stony silence as Marcus detailed the entire scheme, how he'd targeted Eliza, how he'd gathered information, and what Ryan planned to do with it. When he finished, he placed a flash drive on Harold's desk containing all the evidence needed to protect the company. "Why are you telling me this?" Harold finally asked, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "Because I love your daughter," Marcus said simply. "And I can't be the person who destroys her life." Harold stood up, his face flushed. "You think this confession absolves you? You think admitting your scheme somehow makes you worthy of forgiveness?" "No," Marcus replied. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I just want to make sure you and Eliza are protected from what I set in motion." Harold called security to escort Marcus out, but not before delivering a final verdict: "If I ever see you near my daughter or my company again, I'll have you arrested. Consider yourself lucky I'm not calling the police right now." Over the next weeks, Marcus watched from afar as Harold used the information he'd provided to thwart Ryan's attacks on the company. Ryan was furious, threatening legal action against Marcus for breaching their agreement, but both men knew any lawsuit would only expose Ryan's own illegal activities. Marcus found a small apartment and took a job waiting tables, honest work for the first time in years. Each night, he wrote letters to Eliza that he never sent, trying to explain the unexplainable, how a man who had set out to destroy her had ended up destroyed himself, rebuilt by the very love he'd feigned. 3 months passed. Then 6. Marcus heard through mutual acquaintances that Eliza had thrown herself into her work at the foundation, expanding its reach and impact. He was proud of her resilience, even as he ached with the knowledge that he'd never see her again. Until one rainy Tuesday when she walked into his restaurant. She sat at one of his tables, calm and composed, looking somehow both exactly the same and completely different. More confident. Harder around the edges. "Eliza," he breathed, unable to believe she was really there. "My father told me what you did," she said without preamble. "How you confessed. How you gave him everything he needed to protect the company." Marcus nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "Why?" she asked, the same question her father had posed. This time, Marcus had had months to consider his answer. "Because I couldn't bear to be the villain in your story anymore. Because somewhere between the lies, I started telling the truth. Because I fell in love with you, Eliza. For real." She studied him for a long moment. "I don't forgive you," she finally said. "What you did was unforgivable. I know. But I understand it better now. My father looked into your background. I know about your childhood. About your mother. About the foster homes." Marcus flinched. He'd never spoken to Eliza about his past, the poverty, the abuse, the desperation that had shaped him into someone capable of such calculated cruelty. "That doesn't excuse what I did," he said. "No, it doesn't," she agreed. "But it helps me make sense of it." She paused, then added, "I've spent 6 months hating you, Marcus. I'm tired of it." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'd like to order coffee. And while I drink it, you can tell me who you really are. Not the man who pretended to love me. The real Marcus. The one I never got to meet." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even the promise of reconciliation. But it was a beginning. Over the next year, Marcus and Eliza rebuilt their relationship from the ground up, this time with honesty as its foundation. They started as awkward acquaintances, meeting occasionally for coffee where Marcus would answer any question she asked, no matter how painful. Gradually, they became something like friends. Marcus continued waiting tables but also enrolled in night classes, studying business ethics of all things. Eliza watched his efforts with cautious optimism, still guarding her heart but unable to deny the evidence of his transformation. The first time he made her laugh again, really laugh, with her whole body, felt like a miracle to both of them. The first time she called him just to talk, because she'd had a bad day and wanted his perspective, he had to sit down from the shock of it. And the first time she reached for his hand across a dinner table, 18 months after their world had imploded, he knew he'd been given a gift he could spend a lifetime trying to deserve. "I'm still afraid," she admitted that night. "Part of me is terrified that this is just another long con. That you're still the man who saw me as nothing but access to my family's company." "I understand," he said. "I'll spend as long as it takes proving otherwise." What Marcus didn't say was that he was afraid too, afraid that the darkness that had driven him for so long might still lurk within him, waiting for a moment of weakness. He'd been a conman for so long that sometimes he questioned his own sincerity, wondering if this new self was just another role he was playing. But each day he chose honesty over advantage, kindness over manipulation. He felt more certain of the change within him. It wasn't that he'd become someone new, rather, he'd become the person he might have been all along, had life been kinder to him from the start. Harold Harrington remained skeptical, watching Marcus with the vigilance of a man who'd nearly lost everything to betrayal. But even he couldn't deny the evidence before him. his daughter was happy again, and the man responsible for both her greatest pain and her renewed joy seemed genuinely transformed. 2 years after the night Eliza had discovered the truth, Marcus took her to the public garden where they'd had their first date. The same bench, the same view of the pond. But different people sat there now. "I've been thinking about stories," Marcus said as they watched the sunset. "About how we tell them to others, and to ourselves." Eliza leaned against his shoulder. "What kind of stories?" "The stories that define us. For so long, I told myself I was someone who had to take what he wanted because the world wouldn't give it freely. That story made it easy to justify hurting people, especially you." "And now?" she asked softly. "Now I'm trying to tell a different story. One where I'm capable of giving instead of taking. Where I'm worthy of the love I receive, not because I've manipulated it into existence, but because I've earned it honestly." Eliza turned to face him fully. "I like that story better." "Me too," he said, reaching into his pocket. "Which is why I wanted to give you this." It wasn't a ring. It was a key, simple and unadorned. "What's this for?" she asked. "It's the key to a small office space I've rented. I'm starting a consulting firm to help small businesses compete against corporate takeovers. The kind of predatory practices I used to facilitate." He paused. "I was hoping you might consider being my partner. Your foundation work has given you insights I could never have, and your integrity would keep me honest." Eliza stared at the key, then back at Marcus. "You want us to work together? To build something together?" "Yes," he said simply. "But only if you're ready. Only if you trust me enough." She closed her hand around the key, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I think I do," she whispered. "Trust you, I mean. Not completely, not yet. But enough to try." It wasn't the fairy tale ending either of them had once imagined. There was no dramatic proposal, no sweeping declarations. Just two people who had survived the worst of each other, choosing to build something new from the ruins of what they'd destroyed. 6 months later, their consulting firm helped its first client successfully fend off a hostile takeover, ironically, one orchestrated by Ryan, Marcus's former partner. The victory was sweet, but the real triumph was in the way Eliza looked at Marcus afterward, with pride untainted by doubt. That night, as they celebrated with a quiet dinner at home, Eliza reached across the table and took his hand. "I love you," she said, the words both familiar and entirely new. "Not the man who pretended to love me. But you, the real you." Marcus felt something break and heal simultaneously within his chest. "I love you too," he replied. "I think maybe I always did, even when I was too broken to recognize it." They both knew their story wasn't over, that trust, once shattered, would always bear the marks of its breaking. There would be days when old doubts resurfaced, when the shadow of his deception fell across their happiness. But they also knew something else, that love, real love, isn't found in grand gestures or perfect moments. It's built in the patient work of showing up, day after day, choosing to be worthy of the gift you've been given. Marcus had pretended to love Eliza until he actually did. But the greater miracle was that Eliza, knowing the full truth of his deception, had found her way to loving him in return, not despite knowing who he really was, but because of it. And in that love, both of them found something neither had truly known before, the freedom that comes from being fully seen, fully known, and still chosen, every single day.